All right, thank you for waiting patiently. I think we're going to get started with this. They're still working on bringing up the other participant for the panel, but why don't I hand the mic off to Ron, since Ron, this is kind of technically your panel.
Okay, technically.
Hey Ron, this is Vicky Lee. I'm on the bridge.
Hello everybody. That's Vicky Lee from DLA Piper, and she's going to join our panel. And the panel is all about open source technology or open source, and also how it coincides or how can it be synergistic with the world I come from. I was at Intel for 12 years doing telecom, and so I'm going to walk through 2 slides to share with you some thoughts about how can the two work collaboratively together, where you have interoperability, interworking, and still have the benefit of the world of what open source brings to the ecosystem. So Brian Behlendorf, I'm sure you all know Brian. Ron Resnick, I'm the executive director of the EA, and then we have Vicky Lee on wherever you are, Vicky. I think you're in California, right? So
I am in Northern California. I'm and on the phone, so I'm sorry I can't be there in person.
That's okay.
I'm a partner at DLA Piper.
Okay, great. So to kick this off, you guys can hear me okay? All right. I put something together to help you or help all of us understand, because in the world of blockchain, there's a lot of folks who really are trying to figure out the implications of all these different ways you can look at technology, innovation, and how does it come to fruition in products. And so this slide shares with you, and maybe I'm missing one, but feel free to raise your hand and let me know if we're missing one. But looking at the pillars of technology innovation. And so there are 2 slides. One's technology innovation, and the other slide is product innovation. And so to share with you why we have this labeled differently and its purpose, I'm going to walk you through a little bit this slide and then the next slide. And these slides, by the way, if you don't want to take photos, they're on the website. You can just download them as a PDF. So in the world my world that I come from, you have 2, well, actually an SDO, a standards development organization, SDOs. They're very formal. And how many of you guys are familiar with SDOs and know what they are? Raise your hand. I don't need to go there. Okay. So you know SDOs, and there's 2 categories, and the category my world is IEEE, ETSI. The ETSI is in the telecom, but these are all royalty-based SDOs, and those are really challenging. And I've lived with the world of how you stack royalties, and you guys already know how much a phone is burdened in intellectual property and royalties to companies. I'm sure you know who they are. And so that's one way how technology innovation comes to fruition. And then you also have the SDOs that are royalty-free, and ANSI, W3C, ISO. I've spent time with those, but the majority of my life has been ETSI, IEEE kind of land. And then we have the open source foundations, Hyperledger, for example. Royalty-free, not a standards org, but royalty-free, and this is the other source of technology innovation, which is impactful to our world in blockchain and multi-party and DLT. And the last one are commercial entities for profit. So I didn't target anybody who might want to join our org or your org. I only put the Forbes Digital 100 down. You can pick and see who those guys are. I'm sure you already know. But these guys if they can pull it off, they have their patented technology. You have to use their operating system, whatever it is. But then, similar to how open source works, you get their code for the operating system, but you know who they are. Look how much money they're making higher up in the stack. So for them to donate even some of their stuff for free totally makes sense. Android, for example. Let's see. Okay, so this is where it comes to the world of productization, and it's very interesting. In the land of blockchain, there really hasn't been any entities that much who are looking at how you can commercialize solutions that are standardized. But here's where we see the synergy, and Brian and I have talked a lot about this. If you look at what you get out of the first 4 drivers of technology innovation, those guys write everything they can that the super smart engineers can input into their technology innovation, period. And it covers the gamut. So if you look at it could be any standard, any spec, any technology. It could be a giant list of all the things it can do and what they want it to do. But that doesn't mean they're all going to be productized. So the best method, and I believe, and this is how we can collaborate together, is any entity or if an association is formed whereby that association is product innovative driven. That association then takes a look at what are the market requirements based upon the technology innovators, whether it's any one of those categories. In our world, it's the open source community, so that's the ones we would talk about. And the companies that would participate in an association that becomes a standard or a specification, let's say a standardized specification, that then they can determine which are the must-haves or shalls. This is, you guys all know in SDOs, yeah, you must have this feature, but it gets even more tricky, and I'm even seeing that in what's going on in the EA. You should put in performance metrics in these. And then it gets really sticky because many of the folks who are the drivers of technology innovation, then it goes to their product guys, they may not be comfortable in doing that because maybe their company can't deliver. So if you can form an association that takes a look at the technology innovation, they come together and they come to agreement of what are the market requirements, and it could be for different, I'd say, vertical markets. In my previous life, they were called system profiles. Then they can define solutions that can be standardized to a spec, and here's where it gets even more important: certified. So then you find an independent lab that will take a look at these solutions that these products, the product offerings are being marketed, and they certify and validate it. And that's how you get trust, which we're in the world of all about trust or trustless. That's how you can build trust with governments and institutions and big companies to be successfully motivated to purchase whatever the solution is offered, far greater than if a company is saying, here's my own dog food, this is what I'm selling. Believe me, it's better if you have an association. So in our discussions, open source community continues to do what they're doing, and they could be proprietary, they can do whatever they want, but there should be, I believe, a version of the open source that could get thrown over the fence to, and I'm not even talking about the EA, it could be any an association whereby all the players from the business side get together and formulate, these are the requirements for the market, these are the performance metrics, you guys fight it out, because they will, I've seen it happen, and then come up with something that we build trust from all the folks who we'd like to see back it. So you have a global let's say interworking solutions that are based on open source. So this is a model that, and actually I talked to the folks at DLA, and they agreed that this is a good way to go. So we'll continue with this talk, but I wanted to open with these 2 slides, and then we're gonna now chat about, okay, how do we all work together? And there's one last part which I'm going to ask Vicky to talk about. One of the world that I share with you, I came from, intellectual property, patent, IPR, and litigation is all part of all this stuff. I'm going to predict in the future, if we're not careful about this, we're going to see significant amount of I'd say patent infringement or lawsuits on some of the blockchain implementations if we don't do things along lines with the Linux Foundation has done with the Open Innovation Network. And so I'm going to queue up Vicky and some of the folks because I'm going to encourage the formation of a blockchain patent pool to help protect us and for the future. So with that said, I'll ask Brian and Vicky to chime in now, and they could share their thinking, talking about the synergy, what they're working on, and how this might work moving forward. So, Brian?
Sure. And while I'm talking, why don't we cut over, because Vicky, your video is on, right? Yeah. Okay.
I do not have access to video right now.
Oh, okay. We'll, but we can at least hear you, which is great. So I'll just add a few thoughts, and then I'll hand it off to her. Which I guess we could switch over. I'm always amazed when I can show up in a country at whatever level in the development curve, and my cell phone works. Right, and when you think about the tremendous amount of effort that goes in to make something like that so simple happen, it kind of boggles the mind when you come from a world where you can update a website 10 times a day, right? Or you can push software updates once a week to major infrastructures, right? You can't push hardware updates to every cell phone out there in the world, or worse, every telco network out there. And so I've always had a lot of amazement, both for like the stuff that Ron's done with GSMA and with the other kind of standards work in the telco space, as well as at the Linux Foundation we have a couple of telco projects. That world has figured something out that about standardization, about certification, about making this stuff work reliably and perform reliably for a very large population that I think the blockchain world really needs to listen to and understand and figure that out. So I'm always really eager when I hear that those types of people coming into our space, and why having Ron at EEA made so much sense. I also felt some of you might remember like my first blog post as executive director at Hyperledger. I kind of put out there a picture of what we were going to do at Hyperledger and what we were not going to do. Because one of my formative experiences was working very early on the Apache web server, but also simultaneously sitting and then contributing to the IETF working groups around HTTP and HTML and others. And there was a lot of overlap between these two communities, right? There were a lot of people on the HTTP working group, people like Roy Fielding, who was literally authoring the specification, editing the specification, the primary editor, who also was one of the core maintainers and did a ton of work, a lot more than I did, on the Apache web server, right? But the fact that these were two separate initiatives was really important, because it meant that the HTTP standard could be evolved independently from what we were doing on Apache, and all the governance functions, the people we were rallying around Apache could be separated. And that meant people like Netscape, do you remember them? Netscape could be involved in the HTTP standard and push that forward, and we could work together with them even though we had competing products. It meant Microsoft could do that as well. And so it meant that when somebody like AOL pushed an update to their web proxy that broke the web for everybody except AOL users, not only could we say, well, that breaks it with Apache, but you're breaking the standard, and the amount of moral weight that came from that was very different. And then it also turns out running open standards initiatives is kind of different from running open source initiatives from an IP point of view. We at Hyperledger make sure that when somebody contributes a pull request, a line of code, that there's a developer certificate of origin attached to that contribution, and only to that contribution, which says, your rights in this, including patent rights, come across with that contribution. But in a standards process, what you want to avoid are people who kind of sit in on that process, listen in, absorb good ideas, and then go file patents on those processes, or even suggest ideas without declaring that they've got a patent somewhere, letting other people implement them, and then suddenly, everybody owes somebody you've never heard of a mere penny per transaction or penny per phone call or something like that. So that's, you have very different kind of ways of managing those communities. And so, but they complement each other. They're not rivalrous. They're not, people don't have to belong to one and not the other. And they're also not necessarily, they don't need to solve every problem on the planet. The IETF sits next to the IEEE, sits next to all these different standards bodies, and in fact, a little bit of competition between these is pretty good, right? It's pretty healthy. So it's been great to see EEA, and as some of you know, there's a couple of things that have started at EEA and now have come over into Hyperledger. The token taxonomy initiative work has driven some work now in ways to make those tokens work on top of Fabric, on Bezu, on others. There's some confidential computing standards that have now led into Avalon, the creation of Avalon. So, I haven't seen anything yet go the other direction, but I'm sure like the on-the-ground implementation experience of people has helped inform some of the standards work at EEA. So I think we'll continue to see more of this, and I think it'll be interesting to talk more about the patent pool stuff. There are some similar things in the open source community to use as a model to consider, and you all might be surprised who actually is filing patents out there in the blockchain space. It's not anybody who's at this event. I'll just leave it at that. The majority, the one who's filing the most patents in the blockchain space. But aside from that, getting this story out there about the differences between these and what might emerge as a third category, which is kind of the governance function, which we've heard a lot about today already, is how I think this landscape kind of rolls out. And even with lots of options and competition, I think it's how we also do get to convergence.
Thank you. Vicky, how about you filling in what your firm, and they're one of the largest firms, and they have significant interactions, obviously, on Hyperledger, et cetera. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the challenges that you've seen, that you've faced, and your view on what you think would be beneficial to help the blockchain ecosystem survive in the best way possible and to protect themselves as much as they can against IPR infringement.
Yeah, happy to do that. Before I dive into those topics, though, if you don't mind, just a couple of questions, just a level set. So, Ron, in your slides, you mentioned SDOs. Do you equate those with SSOs? Because in my world, we often talk about standard setting organizations more so than SDOs, and I think it might be helpful just to make sure that we're all on the same page about the types of organizations that we're talking about.
So I don't think it matters. It doesn't, and if there's an SSO, that's not on the slide, so thank you. But the only point of talking about these guys, the fact is that the open source community is not standard, and yet we need to figure out how we protect the open source community beyond the scope once it gets to global let's say adoption, where the biggest companies in the world are going to want to are betting down on it. I guarantee you, because I've worked with them, they're going to have their lawyers go look at the IPR of whatever they're dealing with, and they get scrutinized. So it's about what you can share that you recommend to help the blockchain ecosystem protect themselves the way that you guys have done a really good job with regard to Apache.
Yep. Okay, great. And then, Brian, I guess if you don't mind, I'm just going to challenge one of the statements that you made about the difference between open source and participating in a SSO. So you had said that if someone's just kind of sitting in on something and kind of sitting on a patent and then trying to license it later. So I'm curious, most, at least in my world, what we would advise is setting up a SSO. One of the charters, should include a very robust IP policy. So, the participants in that SSO should be, parties to that IP policy, which should protect against, some of the downsides that you described. So, does that resonate with you, or are you thinking about it differently?
Yeah, no, absolutely, it resonates, and I think that's what I intended to say, and I might have skipped a few words there, but definitely that I was trying to contrast that ideal and that way that works for a lot of the standard setting organizations with how things happen in an open source community. IETF is perhaps kind of on the bubble between the two because they are pretty lightweight. But a lot of standards bodies, this is why it's actually hard to have the degree of public accessibility and transparency during the standard setting process, which is even a stray comment. If I have a patent that happens to cover, a novel way of doing something that is obvious in retrospect, retrospect, and I pop up on a conference call and kind of even anonymously say, hey, have you thought about this idea? And that gets somebody else goes, yeah, that's great. Let's like encode that into the standard. That becomes potentially a problematic thing in a standard, right? Whereas on an open source project, the point of transfer is the pull request, is the code contribution. Arguably, if I was pointing to something more substantive, that might be inclusion by reference. But it's just one reason why like a well-designed standards body does think about who is in the room and participate in the conversation, not just contributing to the final document, right?
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. And so that's actually the perfect segue into the point that I was going to make about standard setting bodies. And some of the biggest challenges in setting those organizations up are putting together the charter documents and intellectual property policies that govern exactly that situation that you described, Brian. So, who's participating in the meetings, those, what type of information is being exchanged, how does that feed back into the discussions and the formulations around the standards or the specifications. Our firm often assists standard setting organizations in setting up those policies and also advising clients who are looking to participate in some SSOs, explaining to them what they're signing up for when they're joining an SSO as a participant and a member. And some of those SSOs actually, distinguish between different levels of participation, whether you're an active participant, whether you're in a working group, or you're a more passive member, if you will. And so those standards setting organizations, as I said, have oftentimes very detailed and very robust IP policies that are in stark contrast to the framework, and I use the word framework very loosely, the framework that is often used for open source projects, because the whole point of the open source project is to engender community involvement and open the door to greater level of contribution, greater level of participation and transparency, if you will. And the contribution process that Brian described is the typical process that we see. I do think that blockchain and open source are similar in that kind of the ultimate goals or the principles behind them are similar. Blockchain having a distributed ledger, the security that's associated with that is somewhat analogous to having an open source project, having community involvement, encouraging developers to contribute back best of breed, improving the code base with bug fixes and corrections and the like. So in that sense, I think the philosophy behind blockchain and open source are very similar, but the intellectual property approach or philosophy to each are different and can have a pretty significant impact on a company's productization strategy and business model.
Great, thank you. And in my past life, I've been deposed. I've experienced when I've worked at a large company where small companies wait until the biggest companies are doing. That's what they do, and that's my worry about what's going on in the world of blockchain. And actually, DLA Piper did introduce me to the executive director of the Open Innovation Network, and they've actually offered to help the world of blockchain to add to what they're doing, which I think is great, because the association should not be the patent pool. That's not their world of expertise. It's the DLA Pipers, and it's entities that can build up a it sounds like I'm a proponent of a patent pool, which I am, because that's a defensive effort, because the quantity of patents that you acquire to defend against offensive is how you offset this in the best way.
Do people know about the Open Invention Network? Okay, so let me just give a few minutes on that. So OIN is an organization that's independent of the Linux Foundation, independent of any other org, but they have a lot of us kind of involved in what they're doing. And they started out when there was a lot of concern about the patent profile of the Linux kernel and the Linux operating system, and started as a set of companies saying, hey, we have a common interest in making sure that, some of us have patents, some of us, rather than doing, a billion different cross-licensing kind of things and always worrying about somebody showing up out of the woodwork to kind of claim that, they've got some core patent on something that is hard to work around. Instead, why don't we work together on a pool? And the pool says, if you are a member of the organization, if you're in the pool, then you agree that all of your patents are licensed and usable by everyone else in the pool. And I believe there's also like a defensive only covenant publicly as well. Actually, Victoria might be able to correct me on that too. And then if you're outside the pool, you might still be subject to those companies wanting to license. So there's really a strong incentive to be in that pool. And part of that is defining the Linux system, as they call it, and what's inside of Linux versus what's outside. And over time, they've gradually expanded that definition in partnership with their membership, of course, because it's kind of increasing the scope for everybody of what's in and what's not. And they're looking at a number of different domains. I mean, already in that is, I think, web technologies and containerization and a lot of the kind of new wave stuff that people are tracking. And they're looking at adding blockchain to that definition. Might also make sense to have it be a separate kind of initiative or a separate pool. Lots of different possibilities there. But I just want to make sure, they are a really good organization. They're really creative at how they go out defending this kind of stuff. And they're even able to bring companies like Microsoft and IBM and big patent holders into the pool and make that really work for everybody in the Linux ecosystem.
Hey, Brian and Ron, I'm curious, what your views are on the LOT network.
I'm not aware. Maybe you can cue us in.
Yeah, so LOT is similar to Open Innovation Network. A lot of the larger companies are starting to sign up for that too, but it's basically setting up a framework for springing licenses to come into place if there is a divestiture or a sale of a patent to an NPE, a non-practicing entity. So it provides the companies who have signed up to be participants in LOT some protection against, assertions that are going to be made by NPEs as companies are looking to divest some, non-essential patents or, patents that are not core to the business.
Yeah, so we're going to go now to questions, but one last comment. There's two kinds of patent pools, why I like the OIN, and I don't know about this one. Via licensing and other guys, they're profit-making ventures, and they're tied to revenue-driven IPR solutions. We're not. So we need to be very careful who we pick if we do a patent pool. So with regard to that, let's open. We have about 7 minutes, 7 minutes left. We'd love to have questions. Gentlemen over there. Is there a mic for you? Or?
We'll repeat it. That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'll repeat it for Victoria on that line as well.
So I'm coming out of the IoT world. I've been involved, and I'm a 21451 working group member in IEEE. Also IOC, IEC, and IPC on that side. The difference I saw from there to UPnP, OCF, and ALSI was that the enterprises on the others, the standards bodies, those international standards bodies, whether they're royalty-free or there's a royalty on it, they're actually a standard, and it's not necessarily an alliance. What I find, whether it be in the XSF or the XMPP Foundation or the other consumers, is the enterprise were all happy and everything to go ahead and try to create an interoperability standard. But then until they learned that then their data was going to be able to be accessed by anyone as well. So they're more than happy to write the standard, but they're not willing to engage in it after it goes out. How do you combat something like that.
Well, let me just repeat it for Victoria's sake, if she couldn't hear that, and try to summarize it into a tweet-length question, which I think is some of the more informal standards bodies, XMPP, even UPnP, sounded like one challenge has been you can get the companies to participate, but as soon as it appears that use of that standard threatens their desire to be a platform, their desire for everybody to plug into them, then it might be hard to get them to engage. And we've even seen some standards, kind of like XMPP, kind of gets subsumed when one large gorilla implements it, and then it just becomes an API into a single central thing rather than yeah. So is the question really, how do you get companies to be willing to engage even if they're kind of giving away that part that they wanted to own previously, or is it? Yeah.
So I can show you how I've seen it solved, and so there are multiple ways to solve. But one way, we'll call it a systems approach, and so all the components of the building blocks of, let's say, it could be any stack, architecture stack, can be divided into components. And each individual company may have their own secret sauce of how they're going to write the code for those components. And that's what they don't want to give that away. That's their competitive advantage. So the way I've seen it solved is that you end up coming up in this association, and I'm talking about a formal standards organization that writes requirements, and they write interworking communication protocols that connect the dots between all these different components. But and that's what becomes standardized, and that's why I'm bringing up market requirements and performance metrics. Because if you have all of that three, then then those companies don't have to give away their secret sauce, because as long as they're delivering and communicating to affect the performance metrics and the market requirements, they're good. And this is going to encourage the whole world of blockchain to be accepted by everyone, the regulators and many of the companies who don't want to have a sole source provider. So I can share with you, there's very proven ways how you can manage that. Oh, Victoria, did you have any comment to that?
No, I didn't. I think you're spot on that.
Okay. Okay. Be told one more question, gentlemen. So the question is, typically in the past, and you have the technology, and then you have the management of it. That's very standard. I've seen it countless times. And so how do you catch up? And is there any entity in our world who has oversight of it that's technically neutral? Not at this point. I'm hoping to see that, but I think it's severely needed. So you're spot on, and unfortunately, and maybe I'll just close out with this. This is the first world I've ever entered where people's personal assets are involved, as well as I've never experienced this before. Personal assets are involved. They can be in companies that they work for or not work for. And then there are a lot of young kids who are programmers who don't have this maturity of understanding of the risks they face. So it's been very challenging, and he's going to steal my mind.
No, it's one thing for your phone to get bricked. It'd be another thing for your 401k to get bricked.
Oh, yeah. So anyway, I think this has been very interesting experience even for me. I've been doing this for 2 years, but I don't think there's ever been anything like this before that I've witnessed. Are we done then? Okay. Thank you very much for all coming.
Thank you, Victoria.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Victoria.
Bye.